Oh, that's right.
The entry guide, like revamping it before.
Oh, yeah. So there was a participant who I accidentally sent like a different participant her email for a follow-up. So she was saying that she wanted to do it on Tuesday today, but originally I was asking her if she wanted to do it at 1, so I sent her an email this morning saying, no, you don't have to do it at 1 today. It's okay if you do it on Thursday, but she does want to do it today at 1.
Okay.
But is it possible that we can revamp the interview guide
And have all that ready prior to her
for like
interview.
half an hour?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't think that we're gonna add very many questions. I think it's just gonna be that one question. We can
And the
talk.
stigma definitions.
Oh, we have to define stigma, that's right.
And the app, the explanations of like, remember we did talk about like breaking down that one page because it was like a lot going on in that page.
Yes.
I can ask her if we can push it back to like 1:30.
You can ask that, but don't lose the opportunity to interview her over
Yeah.
it. So I would
Right.
say go with the interview guide why don't we do this? Go with the interview guide that we have, minus the stigma definitions, minus the revamping of that table, but add that one question, because that's simple to do. And we can talk about that quickly before the
Okay.
interview. And then for the next set of interviews, we'll make sure that we have the interview, the definitions, and the table simplified.
So what was the concern with the table?
Was that I just took the table from our proposal
Mhm.
and put it in there,
Mhm.
and it was too much information. There was, like,
Oh, okay.
so he kind of, the participant I interviewed kind of looked at it and was like,
Yeah.
you know, and you don't want a participant to react that way. You want them to feel like comfortable with
Okay.
what you're showing them, right?
Once
So,
you explained it though, he was like, oh, okay, but like
Yeah.
the initial reaction.
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, my bad. I
No,
should've,
I'm
right?
just, yeah. it's
But
just
this
like,
is what
did they hate
happened.
it?
Yeah,
Okay.
no.
Okay.
This
No,
isn't a
that's
proposal
fine.
that's under review, so you can understand why Thomas would be like, what was wrong
Yeah.
with the table? So I think it just needs to be simplified for the purpose of like somebody who's not
Gotcha.
a researcher,
Okay.
right? Okay, so the next step, so remember step 4 was the coding. Just so that you know, in the handout, they have the steps numbered differently than I do in this PowerPoint. I can't remember why. I think they lumped 2 things together that I thought should have been separated out, okay? So step 5 would be to meet with the research team to review patterns. So you meet with the research team, discuss the patterns you each saw in the transcript, okay? And we may be doing this because we're not obviously gonna be able to meet after every interview. We may be doing this with multiple interviews at a time, like, okay, let's talk about the transcript for participant number 1, right? What codes did you see emerge? And that's where with Atlas TI that you can print out your list of codes and the definitions and their families. That's where we should all come with that list in hand so that we're ready to go. So we wanna probably have another meeting earlier because maybe towards the end of this week or the beginning of next, we obviously are gonna come up against the 4th of July holiday, so that's gonna give us a little bit of wiggle room. Because we wanna make sure that we're having a coding structure that we all agree upon early on, so that we're not trying to, settle disagreements later on, right? Decide on the patterns that you look for as a group, usually those you agree on. These are called coding categories, okay? Coding categories should be given a name and a definition. For a statement to correspond to the coding category A, it should have the following characteristics. That's why that definition part in Atlas TI is so important. So that 2 people looking at the same transcript would identify a chunk of text as the same code, right? Review the transcripts again, which is step 6. Each individual member of the group should then reread the transcripts, marking places that correlate with one or more of the categories of codes, okay? Suggest marking statements correlating to each individual coding category with a different color highlighter. And on the paper I had just given you, you'll see they give you an example. I should have printed that in color for you. I can send you the link so that you can view the electronic version of this too. But it's figure 4. So So when you're hand coding, one way to do this is to go through and highlight different category or different codes in different colors. Yeah.
So like correlate by theme?
It could be, you would just have to be explicit about, am I highlighting different themes, different colors, or different codes, different colors? You might do this multiple different times, where you could start out, like, say you have the two overarching categories, which are facilitators and barriers, right? You might go through your transcript first and highlight facilitators all in yellow and barriers all in green. And then, once you've split it out that way, you might go through your transcripts a second time, and now that you know what are what chunks of text fall within the category of facilitators, you could highlight different themes, different colors, or different codes, different colors. It just, as long as you're consistent in the way that you're using that strategy, right? Yeah. For when I did the project that I showed you the manuscript for, I coded, and you could do this in Word highlighting function, right? Different color highlights. I did exactly that. I went through and highlighted different chunks of text, different color depending on the code. So I started with the level of the code, and then grouped them into themes and within each category. Okay. Anything else on this? No, I just said that note that the suggestion is for hand coding, not for data analysis software necessarily. Okay, step 7 is to finalize the coding structure. The research group then meets with their coded transcripts and negotiates until they agree upon on a group coding. The group coding is marked on a separate copy of the transcripts and is the basis for the discussion in the poster or the paper, right? So that is your final coding structure. You should have come to agreement as a team that this is in fact the final set of codes that have emerged from our data. Okay, so this brings us to the video. So we're done at 12:30. So I'm actually more behind than I thought I was, because this video is 20 minutes long. But that's okay. What we'll do is we'll shorten the activity a bit, which will be easy for me to do. It'll still give you enough practice, but I really want you to see this video because I think it's a really great video. Oh, so okay, I linked, I'll send you guys the electronic version of this PowerPoint. I link the reason I'll send it to you is because I link in the PowerPoint to a playlist I put together on qualitative research.
Okay.
And it includes what is qualitative research, developing a qualitative research study, like the methodology, interviewing, okay, focus groups, and then data analysis. And if we have time today, we'll watch the video on Scientific right here because it's shorter. If not, it's only 8 minutes as opposed to 17. If not, then you could always watch that on your own, right?
Leslie Curry from the Yale School of Public Health. Welcome back to our series on qualitative research methods. This module addresses qualitative data analysis. We'll look at the principles and practices of this method. Just to remind us, the goal of this series is to enhance our capacity to conceptualize, design, and conduct qualitative research in the health sciences. There are 6 modules in the series, and this module addresses an overview of qualitative data analysis. I want to spend a moment with this figure, which I think conveys the most essential defining feature of qualitative data analysis. It's an iterative process of individual and group level review and interpretation of narrative data. So we move back and forth between the individual analyst reading and digestion and interpretation of the narrative data, and then the research team, multidisciplinary research team, interpretation of the data.
So when she says interpretation of the data, she means coding, right? That's how you're interpreting your data, is by assigning codes to it.
Data. And the moving back and forth between these levels is really critical to generating rich interpretive analysis. Let's start with an important definition. What are codes? A code is a word or a short phrase that represents the essence or the key attribute of narrative or verbal information. So for instance, think back to the module where I described a study on hospitals who take good care of patients who have heart attacks. And we're interested in what those hospitals do in order to have great outcomes for patients with heart attacks. We may find that the support of senior management within the organization is really critical. A code might be senior management support. These codes are used to codify or to categorize the data. Coding, the act of coding, is the process of organizing the data into chunks that are alike. Chunks or segments of the data that are similar in important ways. And then codes are developed into a code structure. So what is a code structure? Code structure is a compilation of the emerging codes, the codes that are developed during that process of individual and group review and interpretation. The code structure includes brief definitions or properties for each code. And the code structure can also contain illustrative quotes or excerpts from the transcripts that demonstrate that particular property or definition for a code. The code structure might also include guidance for the coders, the analysts, for when and how to use the codes. And really important to recognize that the code structure will evolve throughout the analysis. We often have 10 or 20.
This part, the guidance for when and how to use the codes, what is that? We've talked about it a bit. Yeah, it's the code definition. So in Atlas TI, that's why the definition is so important, is because it should be so specific that you could just show that definition to another coder and they would know exactly what to look for within the text.
20 versions of a code structure in the course of a given research study. So let's take a look at an example of a code structure. This is from a study conducted by one of the clinical scholars in the Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars Program, where I get to teach and be a mentor. Peggy Chen was interested in the professional experiences of international medical graduates who are practicing primary care in the United States. This is a topic very well suited for qualitative inquiry. What are the perspectives and experiences of this very unique population? And so Peggy conducted in-depth interviews with a sample of international medical graduates. And we had a multidisciplinary team on the group, really very important, I think, to the quality of analysis. Here we had an organizational psychologist, another international medical graduate, an individual of expertise in primary care workforce issues. So a very interesting broad range of perspectives on the team doing the analysis. We'll look at the code structure from Peggy's study. This is an example of what a code structure looks like. It's very hierarchical. It looks like an outline you might do for a research paper. The code structure labeled Understanding the Experiences of Immigrant Physicians. Really?
So again, that's your research question, right? So for us, it will be understanding user experiences with code notes.
Important to put the research question, embed it right into the code structure. This helps the team remember, where is it that we're going? What is the target? What is the intended research question that we're setting about to answer with this analysis? This helps protect against drifting off on some interesting new development that you see emerge in the data, but that's not exactly relevant to the research question at hand. So her question, what are the challenges and advantages that international medical graduate physicians face in providing patient care in the U.S. healthcare system? And then you see the tags, codes, labels enumerated here, each with numbers. So a first set of codes is the notion of support, and these are followed by subcodes. So these are
so one of the challenges here, as in any field, is language, right? She's She's referring to codes and subcodes. I would call these codes and these themes, right? It just depends on the individual, right? I wish there was a more unified language here, but there isn't.
Dimensions of this larger bucket of support. So here we might see colleagues and peers as a source of support, mentors, aspects of the training and curriculum that are supportive. And so code structures look this way, with our sort of large conceptual domains, tags or labels, and then subdomains that further differentiate that property. You see the different levels of codes that can be done, some relatively straightforward, support, and others more nuanced and complex. So let's just take a look at number 2, this notion that medicine is different in the US. And this is the focus on professional experiences here. Some of the dimensions of this code are that the culture of medicine is different. In the US, patient demands for technology, $1 million workups. These are some ideas related to culture of medicine. The nature of physician-patient interactions, what those look like, views around patient autonomy and decision-making, and how the IMG, International Medical Graduates, experience that. Authority relationships in the workplace. So you see there's a range of depth and complexity to codes within a code structure. So there are 3 approaches to developing a code structure. The first is a purely inductive grounded method. So really working wholly from the participant experiences that drive the analysis entirely. We do line by line de novo coding, meaning.
So this is the one where you don't come at this with any predetermined structure to your codes, okay? There's no categories or anything have already been established. This is not what you're doing, right?
Every line of the transcript is coded for an emerging idea. Nothing is brought in advance to the coding process. This may employ constant comparisons, which is the process of moving back and forth from the codes to the emerging data to look to see whether or not there are similarities or differences, and developing the code structure to accommodate new ideas. The benefit of a purely inductive grounded method is that it limits the possibility of the researcher forcing a preconceived result. Coming to the research thinking, well, it's all about authority relationships here. The de novo line-by-line grounded practice preempts that possibility. The second approach is a start list method. This process brings a preliminary organizing framework to the table. This is somewhat deductive in nature because we're coming with some organizing scaffolding to the code structure. The initial codes are drawn from things like the researcher's own expertise, what is known about the particular topic of inquiry, the existing evidence base. And so we may come to the study with a recognition that we anticipate certain core concepts or codes will be in those data. And so we come with what we call a start list. Our team described something that's sort of a compromise between these 2 methods, a more pragmatic approach that we call the integrated approach. So this retains the benefits of inductive coding. So we want to be very attentive to what emerges from the data. And yet it acknowledges that certain code types are useful in developing certain forms of output. And so if we're thoughtful and deliberate and we bring a framework to the code structure, we're able to be more precise and efficient in the code process.
So I think this is, for the CodeNote study, this is probably the approach that would be most beneficial, because if you think about what our interview guide looks like, we ask what they like about the program and what they dislike about the program. So I can envision likes and dislikes, but we're retaining that inductive coding, and that we're not ignoring any extraneous, anything that's extraneous to those 2 categories, right? So I probably dislike would be either an overarching theme or an overarching category, depending on once we do the coding. Is there further organization? Like, are there further groups? If there are, then like and dislike would become our categories. We'd have these codes that group in themes. Does that make sense? Okay.
So we begin with broad code types, and then we develop the subcodes from the data. So I mentioned in the first slide, in our first schematic, we saw the iteration between individual and group level review. We'll just walk briefly through this schematic to illustrate, again, the cyclical process of coding and qualitative analysis. So we have our transcript that enters the system. And first, and this is really the most fun part, is to always read the transcript freely before coding. So sitting with nothing other than your eyes and brain and attention and reading the data broadly and without any biasing or assumptions or jumping ahead to analysis or coding, spending time in the data. We then move to create the initial codes and properties. So like in Peggy's code structure, we saw support, and the various properties are defining elements of this notion of support. We bring that initial code structure to coding 2 or 3 of the transcripts within the data set, a cluster of them. And here, we're negotiating and revising the code structure as we move back and forth across the individual and group level reviews, and debating and revising the codes in order to accommodate various perspectives in the analysis. We then bring the code structure through the cycle using batches of transcripts to analyze and constantly negotiating and revising the code structure throughout the course of data collection. Ultimately, the goal is to create a final code structure that then is applied to the whole data set systematically so that we end with a comprehensive, fully coded set of narrative data that we can then begin analyzing at even more complex levels.
That is why in Atlas TI, the function to either rename or delete a code, why Dr. Batch emphasized that so much, because if you can imagine, that is a lot easier than going back and recoding data from the beginning.
That's an overview of the process of coding. Come back to Peggy's project and a code structure, and I want to give you a snapshot of a real live document. This was my commenting on Peggy's code structure, one of the very early versions, and I mentioned we often develop a dozen or more of these through the process, and this is intended. This is the richness of analysis, and we're in fact generating our findings as we go. And so in a very early version of Peggy's code structure, we have the title, the research question, and then the support network. Professional choices was the original second code, rather than medicine is different in the United States. So in this very first version of the code, I offer up some comments over here. And my first, and it is always my first comment, too many codes. And I usually soften this with a smiley face because it's a comment I give all of my students and trainees, who often will come with a code structure of 80 or 100 codes, very diligently developed through the analysis of a set of transcripts. It's way too many to navigate. Ultimately, the distillation is the job of the analyst, and we need to get there sooner rather than later, and working with a list of 100 codes is just untenable and actually not productive. And so we often will advise we want about one single page, single spaced, a number of 8 to 10 maximum codes. And usually we get there as the larger codes merge and are refined over time. But it's important not to start with way too many codes. And another consideration, just deciding the goals, reminding ourselves again of the focus of the analysis so that the codes are deliberate and will inform the primary research question. So just to give you a flavor of what an early code structure looks like. I think this illustration sort of reminds us that we need to be flexible in refining the code structure. And so we come, after our individual analysis, we come to groups where we need to have negotiations about, well, what did you see in that data? Well, I didn't really see that they were talking about authority and decision making. I saw it more as he was describing anxiety around the patient-physician communication dynamic. And so those negotiations happen amongst the team. In those negotiations, codes may need to be expanded to encompass more ideas. You might have to refine the properties of a code. So by this code, we're referring to this kind of power dynamic. We're not referring to physician-patient interactions. You may need to merge into existing codes, and so you're always looking for logic and flow within the code structure and being open to the breaking out or the merging of existing codes. Using software for data management. This is becoming sort of a standard in the field. There are many types of software now for qualitative data management. When I first was trained in the 1990s, we used colored pens and color-coded data spread out over a long table. We're much more efficient these days. And using the software is really seen as a standard. In the papers that I review and the grants that I review, I expect to see that the team is using some kind of software. It's really essential in order to organize large amounts of data and to be able to manipulate those data in ways to really enrich the analysis. Using software also supports transparency in the research process, and I think this is really very critical. As qualitative research becomes more and more embraced in the health sciences, there's a healthy skepticism. What is this process of analysis? What do you mean, you code and you develop themes? And having the data organized in an accessible data set for others to be able to access and interpret from does support this broad goal of transparency, which I think really is.
In the broader literature, you hear this referred to as an audit trail for qualitative data analysis. I have not had specific training in what goes into supporting your audit trail. But as I was doing some background reading before today, some of it is the notes within Atlas TI, right? How did you decide that this was this code versus this code, right? That's your audit trail. What's the decision-making process that went in here? Part of what supports an audit trail is the figure this manuscript shared, which was that diagram of how they'd gone from codes to themes to, right? That's all part of it.
Very important to the field. And an important caution, my friend Ray Mayetta, who actually trained me in the 90s on the first software that was being developed then, cautions us always that software can support the analysis, but it does not do the analysis for you. So it's really only as good as the analytic team is, only as good as the healthy negotiation and debate in the team is, that the software is really simply a mechanism and a tool for supporting those analytic processes. So to close with a few comments, first, probably the most important caveat I can offer up, qualitative data analysis is not easy or fast. I have students and trainees who think I'm going to do a study of 20 interviews and I'm going to finish it in a month and a half. And I often have to set some different expectations. The process of qualitative data analysis is labor and time intensive. It requires multidisciplinary teamwork where people feel empowered to challenge and debate and negotiate, and this takes time. It's best accomplished with a team of people who have different perspectives and bring a different lens to the data. The data collection and analysis processes are iterative, so we need to sort of take off our quantitative orientation hats where we never dig to the data until they're complete and we're ready to run our regression models. But here, we're collecting the data, we're reading it. We're collecting more data, we're reading it. It's really very different sort of orientation. The common approach to analysis is the constant comparative method. I mentioned this is the process of working back and forth between the emerging data and the existing code structure to make sure that everything is accommodated within the code structure. This process does evolve inductively throughout the course of the study. I did mention we often do a dozen or more versions of the code structure. And it's important to document the process and to develop efficient procedures for code dating and management, for data coding and management. Because again, to this point of transparency, the process is long, complex, multifaceted, and for ensuring that we can describe the process accurately in our manuscripts, as well as make the study methods more transparent to consumers of the data, we want to be very, very careful about creation of audit trails or these documentation of processes and studies. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, that helped kind of tie together everything that I was presenting. Okay. All right, so let's practice quickly coding. We haven't, did I say till 12:30? Yeah.
I'm gonna have to leave around noon, but I'm
Okay,
going to.
that's fine.
Okay.
Everybody take a I'm gonna shorten this activity, and here's how I'm gonna shorten it. So I'll start reading the instructions, so at least Tempest, you can have a little bit of time on this. On the following pages, you'll find responses from 125 teachers who were asked the question, what major factors led you into teaching? So that's their research question, right? Your task is to read over the responses and determine the factors that seem to predominate. What reasons are included in these responses? You may need to look at closely related wording from several responses and generate a category name that is not mentioned explicitly. So that's where I was talking about, like, it might be an implicit, right, code. In the process, you are defining categories. The list of categories that you generate should be both mutually exclusive and exhaustive. That means that for this, sometimes you can have a segment of text that has 2 codes associated with it, but for this purpose, they only want 1 code associated with each chunk of text. A chunk of text doesn't have to be an entire sentence. Does that make sense? After you generate your set of categories, which is codes, right? List the categories in a column down the left side of a sheet of paper. Then write the respondent number so that you show how each response should be categorized. Sometimes respondents will mention more than 1 factor. You will need to decide how to handle that. Next, count the number of responses in each category and calculate the percent. So we're gonna cut off the calculating of the percentage, that sort of thing, but just to get a little bit of practice with coding, why don't we go ahead and, so you can see that there are, so this is not, the numbers, participant numbers, respondent numbers are ordered, right? But it's not like there's participants 1 through 399 are all represented here. So it's not 399 responses that we're coding. Let's just practice with the first page. If we can go, individually, go through that first page and create a code for that particular participant response. Okay, does that make sense? And then Tempest, since you'll probably have to leave before we get to that point, the next part will be to, as a group, discuss the codes and decide how we're gonna resolve any disagreements.
Okay.
now that I'm actually getting into this activity myself, let's say instead of going through the entire page, we go up through like or participant 57, okay?
Kristen, are you gonna share the video?
Yes,
Okay.
and I'm gonna share the video from the other day as well. I
Okay.
just have to be here to upload it. I have no idea how long it's gonna take.
Okay.
This one I was smart and I stopped it and restarted it, so it'll be
Yeah.
a smaller file, so,
Okay, good.
yeah, I will.
Okay.
Thank you for coming, Tempest.
Absolutely. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, of course, of course. And I'll reach out to I'll work with Jana to reach out to the team to find a time for a next meeting so that we can start thinking about our approach and all of that for
Okay.
coding.
All right.
Have a good day.
Nice meeting you.
Okay, looks like everybody's done. Okay. So that's what this would feel like. Obviously, I would have read through, like I said before in the training, that you would read through the transcripts in full before you would even start coding. But for the purpose of this exercise, you would then come together with your team after you have coded individually, right? And you would talk. talk about the code. So this, if you're using Atlas TI, this would involve printing out your code list and making sure that you're in agreement on that list and the different chunks of text associated with different codes. So for respondent 1, what did people come up with there for code or codes?
I did help kids.
Help kids. Okay, you too?
Yeah.
Anybody have anything different?
Make a difference.
I said make a difference as well.
I just wrote kids.
Kids,
I did like a impact.
impact, okay.
Intrinsic impact.
Okay, so, this is a good illustration of when the team doesn't fully agree on a code. So we have help kids, make a difference, kids, impact. We coded several different responses, right? One of the future codes I came up with, and you guys can agree or disagree with this, was love of children, right? So one of the reasons I'm thinking that kids might be too broad for this level of coding is that it's not going to be specific enough to differentiate between loving children and teaching.
Okay.
That would be my argument, but I want to hear what all of you think.
I did help kids and then calling. So helping kids was when they wanted to help the kids, and then calling was when they liked kids and they got enjoyment from that.
Okay. Okay. So it sounds like maybe helping kids would be what Amy and I said called make a difference. So do we think, would that make sense to everybody? Yeah, everybody agrees with that? So is there one label that we could give those two? Could we agree upon a label that kind of combines or encompasses both helping kids and making a difference? Or is one label better than the other? What does the team think?
Actually, a couple of the other, well, like I think 2 others kind of focused on like, okay, my teacher motivated me to like do the same, like pass it forward. So maybe it's not even about the kids. It's still like a different topic. Does that make sense? Like paying it forward and then not necessarily helping kids, but maybe that was just what they wanted to do, like working with kids in order to pay it forward. For example, like responding number 4, you said the fervor that my high school band director had for teaching motivated me the most. So maybe it wasn't about kids, but it was just about they wanted to pay it forward and they ended up teaching.
Okay, that could be too.
I really coded it past experience.
Past experience, you coded it, okay.
So I thought it was like totally different than just helping kids, because I feel like a lot of them, like they had a positive experience in the past. So, and that was the main reason.
If I were to pick between those 2 labels, I would choose to make a difference.
Okay.
Just because by helping kids, they're making a difference.
Okay, so it's the broader of the two, so it could, that's a good strategy, what you just did, is because you were thinking of like, what's the more broad term that could encompass both of these kind of ideas that we're articulating. So remember, if our goal is to have a smaller number of codes, if we make the code a little bit more broad, we're likely to have more chunks of text fall into that bucket, right?
Because some explicitly say helping kids later on,
Yeah.
so that could be.
Yeah. And so what we need to then do as a team is carefully define what do we mean by making a difference, right? So how do we want to define that?
Is it bad that I want to say helping kids?
I know, right? Well, that might be part of the definition. So the definition might be an evolving definition as well. So for right now, with the text that we've coded, it really does focus on helping kids, but we might hear something later on. I don't know if this is present in this document, but maybe we hear something about mentoring other teachers, right? And making a difference in that way. So those would be 2 that would fall into the same thing, but then we would have to expand the definition.
So it could be like making a positive difference in someone else's life rather than just kids.
Yeah, making a positive difference in somebody else's life. There you go. That's a good definition to work from. What we might then think about though is maybe mentoring and helping kids are two different things, and then that's when you would have to split that code apart. Does that make sense?
Subcode.
Hmm?
That would be a subcode, like.
Yeah, or it could be that there's enough substance that the theme becomes making a difference and the codes are helping kids mentoring. You know what I'm saying?
Just like they have like the getting support, and I said like parents, friends.
Yes.
And it'd be like, okay.
Yeah, exactly. So do you see why this is, why she and I have stressed that this is an iterative process? Because we don't know, we can't be too wedded to what the structure looks like too early on, because it's just gonna continuously emerge. And what you coded participant 1 as saying might change when you code. So here's a specific example of this. So what Jana was referring to about participant number 40's statement, I don't know if anybody else labeled that any differently. Initially I called that role models, okay? But then when I read the statement from participant number 49, that person said actually the very good and very bad teachers. So then I thought, ooh, that's not really role modeling if you're a bad teacher, right? But it is modeling. So I had revised the code for participant 40 and said models instead of role models, and that enabled me to encompass both of those chunks of text within one code. Does that make sense? Okay, but that doesn't mean that that's what the team agrees with. So it's all about, this is a very, I hesitate to use the term democratic here, because it's not like we take a vote and it's like, oh, 2 people think that this is the code and 5 people think this is the code, so we're going with what 5 people think. You can't just disregard those 2 people because their perspective is important, right? But it is a process where the team has to come to some agreement. You have to. And that's why she said it takes a long time, right? So Jan, I wondered if when you were listening to that, you were gonna be like, oh no, this takes a long time, why am I here, you know? We may not be done with data analysis when you leave. You will have things to report on for your final project, right? But we may still be continuing with data analysis, you from DC and us from here, right? It just depends on how quickly we are able to move along. Yeah.
Okay, so this is technically always changing. So at what point do you like design it? Is this like the first thing you design and then you bring it to everyone, or is there like a point to that since it's gonna end up changing anyway with the amount of interviews you do? Like, is it redundant to like start off with a code list if everyone's just gonna disagree and we're just gonna keep making edits? Like, what's the point?
So that's where she said in the video, you're gonna take 2 to 3 interviews and code them, right? And then you're gonna come together as a team and hash it out on those interviews. What's the code structure we have it now? When you're done with that meeting, you should have an agreement on a code structure, and you bring that code structure to the next 2 to 3 interviews. And then there may be disagreement on those codes, or you may wanna revise the code structure. Yeah, so it's doing chunks of interviews, analyzing chunks of data at a time. So that's why we're having them transcribed as we go, as opposed to, I mean, I guess technically we could have had them all transcribed and then just taken chunks of interviews, you know, gone in order. But, you know, we're doing it more for time than anything else, that we're having them transcribed almost instantaneously. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So have I kind of illustrated how we would have these discussions? Let's do one more. What about participant 6? What codes did you all have for that?
I did schedule and calling.
Schedule and calling, okay. And so you think that maybe calling, and that's where my love of working with kids, is that the calling? Okay.
For like their person.
Okay. Anybody have anything different? Schedule and calling, any different?
I did schedule and love for kids.
Okay, that's what I did too, schedule and love of children.
I did work benefits, it's kind of more broad.
Work benefits, okay.
I did like other pros and then like kids, I was just using kids.
Okay. Any others?
I put passion.
Passion, okay. So it seems like this idea of calling passion, making a difference, they all seem to kind of be similar. We're trying to articulate a similar idea. So then we want to go back and think about like what term is best used, what's the more encompassing term for those. And do you agree? Do those three things fit together, right? Does that make sense? So I actually had 3 codes for that particular one. I had previous experience, and this is an example of how maybe I read. You might read something and hear something very different than your other team members. So coaching, I thought this participant was saying that they've been a coach before. So I called that previous experience. And then summer vacation, I put schedule, which what was the other term that somebody brought up? Job benefit? Yeah. So that might be a broader term, and then we can define that. We could say, and job benefits might include flexible scheduling. Yeah. Summers off, right? And then love of kids, right? So then we just continue to have this conversation until we've agreed on the codes for that one, and that's one interview in essence, right? This is going to be a little bit more complex for code notes because it's going to be many more codes per interview than what we're seeing here. So you could, for practice, go through and continue coding this. You could get together, maybe like the SRI students could get together and see if they can come to agreement on some of these things. But then what you would do is, at least the approach that I've taken in the past, is see if any of these codes group together into themes, right? Or families in Atlas TI. Does that make sense? Is that a helpful exercise to at least start to understand what coding looks like? Okay. Unfortunately, I should have planned for more time for that particular exercise, but I do want to show you the last piece about rigor in qualitative research. I think and I'm not going to specifically review this, but I did put resources in the PowerPoint slides that are about the audit trail that I mentioned. So these are things that we could consult as we're deciding how our team is going to support our audit trail. And you may want to do that with Dr. Wright, think about the audit trail. Okay, this one's shorter.
Hi, I'm Leslie Curry from the Yale School of Public Health. Welcome back to our series on qualitative research methods. This module addresses evaluating the rigor of qualitative research. To remind us of the goal of this series, we're intending to enhance our capacity to conceptualize, design, and conduct qualitative research in the health sciences. There are 6 modules in this series, and this last module addresses scientific rigor in qualitative research. So it's exciting to see that qualitative research is increasingly adopted in the health sciences literature. We're seeing grants be funded, we're seeing publications in high-impact journals, and so it's an exciting time for qualitative research in the world of health sciences. And yet, there are some common criticisms that qualitative studies face. It's important to recognize those and to know that there are techniques, processes, principles that help mitigate some of these limitations. The first is that qualitative research lacks reproducibility. So what is it in that black box of qualitative data analysis? Very different than taking a structured data set for a quantitative study and simply rerunning the code and the statistical modeling. which is reproducible, and it's absolutely true that qualitative methods are not as directly reproducible. A second common criticism is that it lacks generalizability. We talked about small sample sizes in qualitative methods, determined by the principle of theoretical saturation. So we're studying and studying and studying until we hear no new ideas from the data. These, however, are often small sample sizes, and because they're purposefully derived, they're not representative random samples. We can't generalize reliably to a larger population. And the last common criticism of qualitative research is that that there's the potential for researcher bias all over the place in the data collection instruments that we design, in the process of interviewing and collecting data in the field, in the process of analysis and interpretation. And so these are the worries of concerns of people as they address or explore the rigor in qualitative methods. It's important as qualitative researchers for us to recognize and to be explicit about the fact that there are a number of standards, that qualitative research has long roots in a number of traditions. But even in the health sciences, back to the early 1990s, in the BMJ, a paper by Mays and Pope, which I consider really a seminal piece in defining quality and qualitative research.
This video presents a series of papers that are focused on qualitative methods. One thing, Jana, that we might want to have you do is pull copies of these articles. I've had a student do this in the past, and I don't know, I can see if she still has them. But if not, we may want to have you pull them because we can cite you can cite these in your own paper, right, to support your methodology.
Would that support in the implementation, your methods?
In the both,
Okay.
right? But probably mostly in the discussion, right? So when you acknowledge some of these limitations, you can say, however, according to Mays and Pope, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are the hallmarks of a qualitative study, of a rigorous qualitative study, and our team has adhered to these guidelines, right?
And then many papers since then from the NIH, from Kirsty Maltrud in the Lancet, from Giacomini and their group in the JAMA. So plenty of resources. The QORIC tool, which is a checklist for researchers as they report, interview, and focus group studies. So there are many resources that describe the
So for this, you might not necessarily cite it, but if you're adhering to this checklist, right, you know that you're reporting your qualitative findings in a way that is aligned with like the standards in the field, right? So what does that do for you when your qualitative study is submitted to a journal for review? They're likely going to find it stronger than if you just kind of randomly somehow organize your findings, right?
established techniques that do assure rigor and that should be used in order to address the inherent limitations of qualitative methods. When a researcher is reporting a qualitative study, we should be looking for articles to include a whole host of dimensions of the research. And in this series, we've addressed many of these. First, the relevance of the question and the rationale for the approach. And so this gets to the issue of conceptualizing a research study. Why qualitative methods? We need to be very clear in the reporting in our articles why it was we chose a qualitative approach, and within that, why, for instance, we're doing a focus group study as opposed to an ethnographic observational study. And a qualitative article should be very explicit about the rationale for the defined methodologic approach. A manuscript should also be very clear on the sampling strategy. How were the key informants selected? What were the decisions and decisional criteria for selection in the development of a purposeful sample? What was the principle of saturation? How was that achieved? And very clear detail provided in the methods section of the manuscript.
So before earlier Tempest had asked the question, like, how do you quantify saturation? we may wanna look at some existing articles and see how they've articulated it. In my experience, I literally just said in my article, interviews were conducted until saturation was achieved. I told you I conducted that study quite a while ago, so I don't think that's gonna cut it anymore. I think that we need to be able to articulate that more clearly, like what that means. So that I don't have to pause it again, I'm just gonna point this out right now. If you see under analysis, it says training. This is why I was saying, like, we can, and you can do the same thing in your work with Dr. Rigg. You can say that data was coded by by the lead investigator of the project, along with a undergraduate research assistant, which is probably how you'd be referred to, right? Who participated in a 3-hour-long training on qualitative data analysis, right? So that just participating in the training adds to the credibility of you as a qualitative researcher.
I've also done qualitative research before. I just didn't know if it counted because I had like a code book already. It was like I listened to I watched like script like interviews, not interviews, like teacher-child interactions like in the classroom, and then like there was like it's called class and you have to like be certified reliable in it.
Yeah.
And then we did the iterator thing. So would I put that in there or?
Yeah, you could
Okay.
all that, you wouldn't put any detail. You
Well,
would just
just
say
say
who had
experience.
previous experience with
Okay.
qualitative data analysis. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay.
In terms of data collection, we like to see the interview guides. It's very useful for reviewers and for readers of an article to be able to see what the instrument looked like.
You
the
saw they did that in the
interview guide
article,
itself.
right?
And
That
often
we looked at.
we have the opportunity to include these as appendices in more and more online journals for peer review of empirical work are
Ours
offering
would be
appendices.
appendices because it's too.
We also want to know about the depth of the data, and so for commentary within the analysis section that addresses a number of features of analysis. The number of coders who were on the team, what their training was it a multidisciplinary team? What did the code structure look like? This is another product of the research study that we like to see submitted with manuscripts and included in online appendices for the consumers of the study to have a sense of how the analysis progressed. We want to understand systematic processes, the use of software. Were divergent cases included? What happened when there was disconfirming evidence? How was that handled? Was there a process for participant confirmation that respondents validated findings themselves? Was there an audit trail? This is the process of documenting the analytic process that I referred to in a prior module.
So we may want to think for our team about participant confirmation. That would involve bringing the code structure back to the people who we interview and asking them if they think that this, it might not, they may not have communicated all of the codes, but is what they feel about code notes represented in this coding structure?
So we want to be looking for all of these aspects of the methodology in published articles. So to remind us where we've been, this series.
So that's the end of new information for that particular. Okay, so I mentioned that I have resources for the audit trail. And then just finally, this is what it looks, the formula for reliability looks like in qualitative research. So it's the number of agreements divided by the number of agreements plus disagreements, right? So, excuse me. Thank you. Excuse me. Okay, is it gonna come in threes? No, okay. Another way of thinking about this is it's the number of agreements over the total number of codes. Does that make sense? And so I wanna say, I've seen like 80s reliability being a good reliability. I'm not sure if there's a rule of thumb in qualitative research on good reliability. We would have to look at, and I don't know if Miles and Huberman make a recommendation for what your reliability should be. Obviously, the higher iterator reliability you have, the better, right? And that is it. Any questions or comments? Right, almost up until 12:30. Okay. So like I said, I will make this available online, and to the people who weren't able to be here, it'll be online as well. I will also make these electronic versions of these documents available. Probably what I'll do is I'll put everything in, I'll probably put the recordings on YouTube, but then I'll put all of the documents in like a Dropbox or a box file or something like that and share it with you. I'm not sure if I'm gonna do this yet. I have to actually get advice from a mentor. For those of you who are considering faculty positions in the future. Is that where you're hoping to go in the event? No, you're not?
Excuse me, Dr. Alberger is practice-based.
Practice-based, okay. But for those of you who are considering faculty positions in the future, if it's a tenure track position, you'll be required to submit a packet of information and in your 6th year, at the end of your 5th year, that articulates all of your accomplishments over the course of your assistant professorship. And part of that is evaluations. So like you've been asked to evaluate your professors and your courses. That all goes into that professor's tenure packet. So I'm saying this because I may send you a link to provide an evaluation of this training. I just need to find out from a mentor if the effort of putting together that evaluation is worth the time for me to put into for the tenure packet. I might do something similar for the qualitative interview training too. So, all right. Well, thank you. I hope this was helpful to you guys.
Very helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do we want to talk quickly about